charge of the climate change, the response program at the National Park Service. It was really interesting to see the Heartland Institute talk on Wednesday. That was here on campus. That was kind of climate denier, but you know that whole issue aside, I would recommend. I don't know if it's available online again for folks who didn't see it to go and check it out. But a comment from the presenter, I'm going to there. Yeah. He said something like, "Well, we shouldn't be concentrating on climate models and what's going to happen with energy. We've got plenty of energy with natural gas. This climate, these greenhouse gases, the biggest one is water, and it doesn't really matter if you put together." Okay, so forget about that, you know. But he's like, what we really need to think about is understanding how dynamic climate is and make sure we're managing our resources to understand that variability and those issues that are happening on climate. And I was like, well, I guess we can agree, the climate science in our seminar series can agree with even that, you know. It's sort of, you know, there's no denying that weather is kind of dynamic, changing, non-stationary, however you want to do it. And so, you know, one of our closest colleagues, not just in proximity, but because where the Park Service is on both climate-friendly parks and really thinking about climate science and changing climate and how you manage that is the Park Service, the Climate Science Center. So it's fantastic to have Lee here to talk about, especially, I guess, it's more the scenario planning, which is an effort that she kind of led with the Park Service. I'll just give you some background. She had worked came to the Washington office, which is in Fort Collins, so a bit confusing. People who aren't familiar with some of the things in government, but it's here in Fort Collins, but it's the Washington office, which is the national lead on that. But was with Glacier National Park leading an effort called Crown of the Continent, which was it is still, and it's a pretty effective array of kind of considerations for a large area type of study. She served as National Coordinator of NPS Research Learning Centers and has a PhD in MS in Oceanography from Oregon State University. Quite a range of background and excellent foundation which to lead the Park Service and what they're doing. So I'll let Lee take it over and tell us about it.
Thanks, Jeff. I can bring this up.
Here.
Yep. So climate change presents some really big challenges for resources management. Are most of you students in resources programs, or is this a mixture? Is this a class or a mixture of people? Mixture. Yeah. I mean, and so we're really challenged by how to manage resources in the face of climate change, and it certainly brings into question the condition in which we're going to leave the environment for future generations. What you're seeing here are some slides that are visualizations of repeat photography, and these were taken at Kenai Fjords in Alaska, in southwest Alaska, which is an area that's seeing some very big changes due to climate change over the last century, and especially right here you can see changes both in snow and ice, as well as some pretty big vegetation changes. And these were produced at the Research Learning Center up there, the Ocean Alaska Research Learning Center up in Kenai Fjords. So in general, for conservation management and resource management, we rely or have relied on the past to inform our planning and our management. We know now that knowledge of the past isn't sufficient to guide the future. So we're in uncharted territory. We're looking sort of peering into the fog, if you will, and needing new strategies and new ways of thinking about how we're going to manage it. We can't just use the past as our guideline and sort of recreate those conditions. You know, what are the tools that we can use, and how do we chart our way into the future? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some sort of bigger picture roles of parks and protected areas in the realm of climate change, and then I'm going to focus in on a particular tool that we've been developing to help us manage under uncertainty, which, as Jeff said, with scenario planning, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And within this, I'm going to touch on, you know, some of the main areas that we focus on in our climate change response program, and maybe at the end, if you've got any particular questions on that and what our priorities are, I can try to highlight those for you. So I'll just arrow through, I think, before you guys can read that. The Park Service mission is one of a very high level of protection, that we preserve unimpaired the natural and the cultural resources and the intrinsic values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, the education, and the inspiration of present and future generations. We cooperate with our partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resources and resource conservation and outdoor recreation through the U.S. and globally. So the National Park Service and our system of protected areas is recognized internationally as leaders in conservation and conservation management. But obviously, with what I just said, climate change challenges our ability to do this. So how do you, if climate change is ubiquitous and it's happening everywhere, and this really doesn't come out for you, does it? I'll read it to you. This is a quote from our director, John Jarvis, who has stated, "I believe climate change is fundamentally the greatest threat to the integrity of our national parks that we have ever experienced." So we have this challenge, challenging our ability to meet our fundamental mission of protecting these resources unimpaired. But at the same time, this brings, I think, a new focus and a new emphasis on what the role of these protected areas, like national parks and wilderness areas, what is their role in this changing environment? So I want to talk just a little bit about that. I'm going to walk through kind of 4 different categories of sort of big picture roles of protected areas, and it's essentially conservation, adaptation, science, and education. And there are nuances to that, but that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it in these 4 big categories that are ways that protected areas and protected area managers need to sort of step up and already do offer society benefits in this regard. So the first one on conservation, we conserve biodiversity, ecosystem services, as well as cultural values. And protected areas have been, hot spots for biodiversity now for decades. And we provide these natural areas provide services to society like clean water, soil stabilization, buffer zones from disasters or other kinds of events, genetic reservoirs, recreation, solace, cultural, archaeological sites. There's a whole number of things that you can talk about as services that that protected areas and protected resources provide. These are sometimes difficult to quantify. You've got groups that are working on how you quantify that. You've got groups that are opposed to quantifying some of those services, but oftentimes when you look at trade-offs and values and how you should use lands, it's pretty important to be able to articulate some of those values. So protected areas were, generally natural areas especially are set up under a constant environment. So many systems that were set up to protect particular resources in their enabling legislation, we know now that these systems are shifting, and they're going to shift in unpredictable ways. And so the result is that some of the species and the habitats that these areas were designed to protect may not exist in the same way or in the same configuration into the future. So while there's this need for for conservation to be elevated, to provide these services to society, at the same time it becomes a lot more challenging and complex if these systems are also shifting out from underneath you. So we have to rethink what our goals and our targets are. We can't just rely on, we were created for a specific resource. We have to think about, well, what's the meaning of that resource, and how can we articulate that in a different way to society? Okay. Oh, and this is just to remind me to mention that it's not only the big organisms that you see out there, the charismatic megafauna. Sometimes I call this charismatic meiofauna. We have to remember that the diversity of the system goes up through the food web, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that. So a lot of what is valuable becomes even harder to articulate to people if it's not that visible, but these are the fundamental components.
Those are charismatic?
Those are charismatic meiofauna. Maybe they're non-charismatic. Depends on what your perspective is, exactly. Yeah. All right. So I mentioned conservation, so conservation of, diversity, cultural values, so conservation in general, that protection. But another really important role for parks and protected areas is this idea of adaptation. So we have protected areas can be one of the most effective tools for adapting to climate change. And if we think about how we use them, how we link them, and you've got here an image that came from the former of the acronym is CONAB. It's the Mexican National Park System. Ernesto Ankerland, and he actually used this idea of species highways and sort of, within a talk that he did at the George Wright Society to talk about how we need to connect and think across our boundaries and our borders about these highways where species are going to be moving, hitchhiking up the road. And so this idea of connectivity is a hugely important one. Buffer zones, the ability to provide refugia, just overall enhancing the resilience of the system for species to be able to move and adapt. And protected areas are going to be essential. They are already essential. They're going to be even more essential, but this requires a very high level of collaboration. So we do work together, but we just have to step our game up in terms of collaborating across boundaries in order to have a bolder vision. And that goes beyond our current system of protected lands, but really starts to think about where things are going to identify, key features on the landscape. And this idea of a network of protected areas is the strongest vision that we can put forward, I think, for how protected parks and protected areas can benefit society as we move forward with climate change. And the third one, in terms of science, enhancing science knowledge. Obviously, conservation under climate change requires a high level of science knowledge, and this is a cutting-edge area of research. New information comes in all the time, so it really requires a stronger connection between science and management and strengthening that capability. Parks and wilderness areas especially provide these baselines for change. They're some of the best places that we can go, as Jill knows and has spent her life doing research to understand the fundamental makeup of the system and how it works in places that are least modified. So we need to be able to articulate and elevate that role as well. And then communication. I think the bottom line on this, I've got some different captions, if you will, on how we do citizen science, youth initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit later, engaging the public in natural classrooms. I think that the basic concept here that I want to get across is that if in a future where people are going to be vying for limited resources, it's going to be even more critical to demonstrate the relevance of protected areas to people. So, how do you let them know about the charismatic Maya? How do you make somebody care about that or allow them to understand in a way that they care? So the relevance of systems and the way we communicate that, we really have to step up our game. I think that's just fundamental key is we have to be able to demonstrate why people in cities or why the average person should be worried or should care about what happens in places that are not necessarily in their backyard. And if we don't do that, well, it's just imperative. We have to be able to do that. In that's sort of that backdrop of these roles for climate change have kind of provided, a backdrop for us in the National Park Service to think about climate change response program and what are the key components and what do we want to focus on. We developed a strategy, a climate change response strategy in 2010, and the four, we call them pillars, or the four sort of basic elements to that for goals and objectives were science, adaptation, mitigation. You mentioned climate-friendly parks. I'm not going to talk a lot about that because it's not really in my jurisdiction in the Park Service, but we have a really strong program for reducing emissions and sustainability in green parks that has a very strong climate change component. So this is a service-wide program and a service-wide view that very much embraces that part of our role as well, and then a very strong emphasis on communication. And what you see over on the left is sort of some of the follow-on categories from that. I've got the strategy developed in 2010, the action plan we just completed. It's under internal review right now, and will come out in the next probably 2 months, be out by the end of the year. And so the numbered areas over there are just sort of how we group some of our priority actions. So we actually, I'm going to talk about scenario planning. We actually used scenario planning to develop our action plan because climate change is kind of a volatile issue in terms of funding and people's opinion. We started our program in 2010 with some new money under the Obama administration, and have had challenges to that because we're in a challenging economy, and people are questioning, and rightfully so, how we spend our money in the federal government. And as you mentioned, there are a number of people who don't think climate change is probably the biggest issue that we should be focusing on. So our program, as well as other programs in the federal government, have been, scrutinized, continue to be. And so we have some uncertainty in terms of here's the big, bold vision and the things we know we need to do. We can establish that, but it takes money. So the question is, what do you really need to do? You need to do this contingency planning. Maybe we all do, but we definitely need to do it here in terms of, if we get the support to go forward with some of the strong partnerships in the science and the research and the monitoring that we need a plan for that. But if we don't get that, what do we do with existing resources? So we've really been thinking about what are our priorities under different sort of decision scenarios, not just climate change, but in terms of the public support, budgetary issues, and that. So the category over here really reflects the focal areas for the next 2 years. And there are actions under there that we're doing regardless. We now have some staff. We're doing this regardless. I'm not going to go into the details of the actions, but it just sort of represents a range of things. I will touch a little bit on some of the adaptation tools and options and on communication. Because if I were to bring this down to sort of just 2 main areas of focus that are critical, one would be internal communication, raising awareness, providing literacy training for our park staff. If we can fundamentally do that in 5 years or 10 years, we'll have a new organization. We need to get this issue into the thinking of everybody. It affects everybody's operation. So that's fundamental. And the other that goes along with that is getting it into planning. You've got to consider climate change when you look out. And, we're like any organization. We generally have a sort of a static view, as I mentioned, and you tend to repeat what you've done previously. And climate change is just this thing that comes in at odds that people don't really know how to grapple with. So we're working on some techniques to help them do that, and then getting it incorporated directly into a range of planning activities. So those 2 things are major for us. So given that, I want to give you just kind of, this is a conceptual diagram. We've actually walked it out as a logic model previously, but for right now, let's just kind of look at the arrows. And we're calling it an end-to-end framework. An end-to-end is something that a lot of people use that terminology, and it's just a way to think about what are the steps, what are the basic elements for doing adaptation. It has to be flexible design. And this is something we were talking about earlier, Dennis. The first thing that we start with is what's the question? And we don't jump in and say, what does the science tell us? We say, what do you want to know? What are you concerned about? And frame the issue, because if you just looked at what does the science tell us about climate change, you're going to be overwhelmed. Scientists are overwhelmed. There's a lot of information, and it's all relevant to somebody, but it really depends on what's your scale, what is it you want to know about. So when we go in and talk about adaptation with a park or a group of managers across a landscape, the first thing we do is get them to talk about what is it what do they want to know about, so that we understand what the scale of the question is. And then we start to look at what science is available, what's appropriate, how can we synthesize that and aim it toward that question. Always having some element of exploring plausible futures. And you see arrows between those because this is sort of iterative in terms of whether it's scenario planning or forecasting or different ways to peer into the future. You need to have science to help you with that. So these are interactive. And so we use scenario planning, but we use forecasting. We use those together, and there's a distinction between those 2 ideas. I mean, one is to put together what you know or what you think you know, and to model it to the best of your ability, and to put some, error bars and parameters around it. And oftentimes you'll get, discrete variables like temperature or emissions or precipitation. Scenarios are a richer storyline that incorporate all of those values and incorporate multiple storylines in order to, start to think about the uncertainty. And then obviously, not just doing this for the fun of it, although it's fun, but you want to apply it to something, implement the action and feedback, and that's the hard part. Actually, that's the hardest part, of course. So again, scenarios offer a tool for exploring actions under a range of futures, provide the framework, for decision support, and I explained this already, this idea of forecasting around sort of a center, most likely situation versus looking at, sort of the range of possibilities and trying to consider wild cards and broader possibilities. And this is just a list of the parks, fairly current, that we've worked with in terms of just exploring this as a possibility and exploring the techniques and the methodologies and how do we do it. And we're sort of in the Park Service moving more into what I would call operationalizing this now, in terms of this exercise for us has been almost like research and development. We've been working with parks to see what they want and what tools work. We have a pretty good grasp now on how to do this. We're starting to apply it more. So, to just give you a little exercise, I just want to maybe step back for a minute and tell a story. For those of you that have heard this, you may have heard this before, I don't know, Dennis, but this is a map, obviously, kind of an unusual map. I don't know if anybody's seen this before. Do you see anything different?
A strange projection, I just say.
Yeah. So what's odd about this? Yeah. Weird. Yeah. So this was made by a Dutch cartographer. His name is Herman Mol, and he was commissioned by the King of Spain to produce a map. They sent Spanish explorers out, explore the New World, and you've got explorers coming around the Cape of Good Hope, coming up the coast, running into water, Baja. You've got people coming down from the Huanuco area, seeing the islands, and sending this information back to Herman Mol, and he's a good Cartesian, so he knows how to connect the dots. So he's connecting sort of landmass, water, island, landmass, water, island. So lo and behold, this is where the Gulf of California came from. It came from the mind of Herman Mol, and he puts the map together. And it'd be great if that was just an exercise, but maps tend to get used. And this map was used by the Spanish missionaries to come over, and they would land on the west coast near Monterey. They would set off to do their missionary work, and they would take their longboats, and they would disassemble them, and they would pack them on the backs of their mules and head out across the Sierras, because they knew that they had to cross Gulf of California. They were going to hit this body of water before they got to the mainland. They had to have the ability to get across. They're going up the 11,000-foot peaks of the Sierras with their longboats. Kind of painful, and they're coming down the other side, and they're looking for the water. They're looking for the beach, and they finally find the beach in Nevada, and they have been told you can still find remnants of longboats in Nevada, where they finally are like, to hell with this, and they're not very happy about it, because this is a lot of work, and they're being asked to do things that they really needn't do. This seems pretty stupid. So they send word back, and they go, your map is wrong. You're having us do things that we don't need to do. And Herman Mol's like, no, my map's not wrong. You're just at the wrong place. You just landed at the wrong place. So, the bottom line is it took 20 or 30 years and an edict from the King of Spain to get the map changed. And so the point of this that I'm trying to make is that if you get your map wrong, or you extrapolate from data, and you get your map wrong, you do some silly things, right? you think you know, you make assumptions, you know this is the way it is, you plan it, and you move forward. And so this is just an example to get you to realize that mental maps, physical maps are very hard things to change once you get time. So this is just scenario planning for us is just a tool to try to uncover what our assumptions are, to try to get at these places where, you know, we think we know. You don't always know where your assumptions are, so you need tools to kind of help you open up, and that's what we're using this for, a way to challenge our mental maps. So again, it allows us to explore some different futures. It allows you to test your decisions. It allows you to do this what if, you know. And it's rehearsing, and there are examples that, you know, I could cite of where this has happened, where people explored very odd, you know, probably low probability scenarios that they thought were silly, but just because they've gone through and thought, oh, okay, you know, what would I do if this happened? And then some situation comes in the future, and they're like, oh, you know, we walked through this before. We thought about this. Maybe not exactly, but we thought about this. So we know better how to respond. So it strengthens your ability to, you know, to take advantage of and adapt to changes over time. And this is just a quote from one of the superintendents in our workshop, one of our workshops. It just, for them, you know, gives them a tool to think about climate change in a constructive way instead of being overwhelmed. It helps you parse the information out. Allows them to work the issue a little bit so that they can start to see where it fits into their day-to-day activities, you know, without sort of going to the climate scientists, tell us how the future is going to unfold, tell us what we should do. Give some ownership and empowerment to people who have to make the decisions. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, and this is the first one. So one method for doing scenarios in this, what we call the participatory approach. So what we've been working on is using science to inform what the drivers are, what some of the impacts are, but also having individuals who have to make decisions construct scenarios so they get a feeling for, if this varies and that varies, what would we end up with? So one of the ways of doing it is a very simple 2x2 matrix approach. You just take two variables with end members, you know, and you cross them, and then you talk about what goes on in these different categories. So this is not specific, well, it is specific to climate change in the sense that we ask the question, what are the big picture drivers? What are the things, like I talked about before, that affect your ability to make decisions? And this was with a group of managers, and they went through, we listed them out, you know, a bunch of things, and then we started honing in on what are the ones that are the most uncertain and the most consequential. Those are the ones you want to work with the biggest differences. The ones they came up with are the nature, leadership, and support on climate change. Like, some parks are going, I don't even know if I'm supposed to talk about this. And, you know, we don't really know if we should make it a big part of our program. We're not being told. We don't see the leadership. We see disconnected initiatives. We see lack of commitment, varied approaches. People are more interested in short-term issues. That's kind of the left-hand side of the leadership versus a situation where you're hearing from your boss and their boss and the overall administration that this is important. We're going to align around it. You know, those are two different situations. So that was one of the axes, long-term perspective. And then the other one, which you might think is the same, but it is quite decoupled, is what does the public think? So in an organization like the Park Service, it really matters. We manage public lands, and they're not necessarily the same as what the leadership says. So you may have a local public that is very keen on climate change. They see the importance of it, they want to be doing something, and you could have that local public be engaged, you know, and not have senior commitment and leadership or with it. At the same token, you can have a public that really doesn't get it, doesn't care, and doesn't want to see you tackling this topic. So we've got two axes with these end members, and then you say what happens in the intersection. So you'll see the way we named them over here. When you've got heightened understanding from the public, but no commitment in leadership, we call that radical revolution. That's a world in which you have bottom-up innovation, because it's your local people that are driving it. You don't really have the top-down structure to work with it, but you've got energy from local constituents. If the public doesn't care, Leadership doesn't care. And somebody trying to work on climate change, we call that, is anyone out there? Because, you know, and I think many of us have worked on climate change for a long time, have been in that world a lot. We recognize that world. A lot of parks still think they're there. A lot of people, when you ask them, where are you, they still feel like it's where they are. If you're in a situation where, okay, we got a new administration and we got this program and we're going to do climate change, and the park is going, my public doesn't really care. I don't really see where it's relevant to me, but I'm just being told this is something I'm supposed to address. That's a world of intrusive bureaucracy. You're just sort of being mandated to do something that you don't really understand the point of it, right? Versus everybody's in alignment. Leadership strong, we'll know this is a big deal. We call that big problems, big solutions. That's when we face it full on and bring all the resources that we have to bear. So those are different decision environments. And we've used this a lot. That's not the only way you could draw this out, but it's just an example of how you can kind of use these variables that really, you know, contribute to your ability to make decisions, and what that means. So the actions that parks would take in those different situations could be quite different, right? Yeah.
How hard is it to get to, I think you said the criteria is sort of most uncertain and kind of
consequential.
Most consequential. How hard is it to get down to kind of like just two? I mean, I know you can do this a three-way, but it gets a little bit more complicated,
you know,
three or four ways.
The way you get there, you may have 3 or 4, and if you've got a group of this size, you can break into 4 or 5 people. You could have, you know, several drivers that people want to work with, and you say, you 5 go off and take these 2 and cross them and experiment. So you simply go work with it for a little bit. Everybody does a different matrix. You come back together and you talk about it. And the goal, if you're using this technique, the goal is to get at least 3, hopefully 4, as in this case, divergent, plausible, relevant, interesting scenarios. So, you know, you want them to be plausible. They need to be realistic. You want them to be different. You want them to be relevant. And you can get a set of them, and they speak to you, and you can work with them. You've got something to work with. And so that's a really important point. It's not saying this is the only, you know, set of scenarios that would be worthwhile. It's just a way of organizing your thinking. It's like, it's useful. Yeah. But you might have 2 matrices you want to work with. I don't know. I mean, yeah, so talk about that. So an application, I'm going to talk now about another application of scenario planning, more specific to climate change and with a given park. So this is Assateague Island. It's a barrier island in the northeast. It is managed, there's the island up there on the right. It's on the island, you have the National Park Service is managing part of it. You've got the Fish and Wildlife Service managing the refuge part. You've got a piece that belongs to the state. So it's a fairly complicated area with people with different missions and different mandates. Sea level rise as well as human manipulation of the shoreline, which has caused sediment starvation. So those 2 factors together have sort of threatened the existence, the continued existence of the barrier island itself. So they're trying to grapple with a lot of different factors. So some of they've been considered as an island at threshold in the sea level rise assessment, I think that was done under the climate science program. Assateague was pointed out, and you know, so they face segmentation of the island with storms now because they're right at that threshold. So storms come along and you can break it apart. They face overwash, and sort of migration may happen that pushes them back to the mainland, or just disintegration of it entirely. So they got some issues to deal with, and you know, they've got some species of concern. Obviously, there's a couple of them there, but they've also been doing some pretty creative things. So when we went to work with them, we talked again about what are the issues of concern, and of course breaching and all of that is important. And then what are the drivers? So we did this exercise of what are the drivers. These aren't the only ones, but we ended up sea level rise, obviously. I mean, that's just a huge one. And then for them, the other one was what were the storms, whether it's the nor'easter nor'easters or the hurricanes that come in, because the storms come in and they're really the ones that drive this. Sea level rise is coming up, and you've got questions about the rate. And ultimately, you're going to have inundation of salt water, and but the storms are the ones that come in and just reset the whole environment. And so how those interact in the future with one. And so they went through this exercise of describing what's happening when you have high sea level rise but less storms, or high sea level rise with frequent storms. And part of the exercise is naming them. So like with high sea level rise, but you don't really get more storms, they just called that drowning in place. It's going to be this creep of change that happens, but not just a big blast. Like if you get those two happening together, they call that the sandbar, because they're just going to go from an island system into very fragmented. So these bullets are kind of what are the things that go along with that. Interestingly, and this is kind of how you can be creative with this sometimes, and this kind of gets at your question, Jeff. One of the other factors that we considered that was really important was just sort of the overall availability of fresh water, that they hadn't really thought of that much. So we had another matrix we were working with, and it wasn't as diverse. It didn't have that much going on. But when we decided to really go with this one, we had this need to still consider fresh water supply. It wasn't something they'd really thought about. And so, we ended up taking this side of it over here and breaking it into two possibilities, where in one case, you've got, in this case, you had actually variation in precipitation and drought that pushes you into sort of a lowered water table. We brought in the issue of lowered water supply, whereas it didn't play out as a bigger factor. So, in essence, we ended up with 5 scenarios that we were able to. So I wanted to show you this because this is kind of a toggling that you can do here with yet another factor. I don't know, it's like really confusing. Show this so you kind of get the way to kind of parse it out and get at it. Interestingly, for acetate, that this particular one, parched, was, and in the end they called it parched pony, because they thought about, what's the bigger environment that's played down in. Well, they've got these acetate ponies, but they're not native, but they are the resource that people want to see. Google acetate island, that's the stuff that's other things. They figured, well, lowered water supply, that's going to be this iconic effect on the animals on the island. And so they've started actually measuring their groundwater now. They didn't even have a monitoring. That was one of the areas that came out that they hadn't realized could, be a potential big deal for them. All right, so what do you do when you have that matrix? The next step is to kind of stand back and go, all right, we've got actions. You sort of look at the effects and then you map it to what are the actions we could take under these different situations. So you could list out the actions in each quadrant, and then you sort of think about, all right, how do we want to approach this? Do you do this sort of robust option, which says we're only going to do actions that will work out well in any scenario? Those are the things we're going to focus on doing. Do you decide to bet the farm? Do you say, what, this is the thing, this is what I think is going to happen. We're going to put all our energy there because we really believe this is the way the future is going. Do you hedge your bets and just say, I don't know, I'm not going to do anything. See, or I'll do some little things. Actually, this is really what we do. In the absence of this kind of planning, that's generally what we do. It's kind of nothing. We wait and see. More science. But the other is this idea of core satellite, which I think is kind of an interesting one, which says, well, we don't know which way it's going to go. We don't want to bet the farm, but we do want to be kind of strategic. So we're going to focus mostly in one area, but we're going to invest in some actions in these other areas. We're going to monitor and kind of try to see where things go so that we can recognize if we're shifting into one future or the other. This just allows you to sort of get a strategy. Just some examples of what acetate actually did, which is kind of cool. They've done several things. They, in their general management plan, are now moving their infrastructure back off of the surf zone. That's fairly logical. And in this map, it sort of shows where the high tides or where the storm surges come, what that map on the left is. They're also doing flexible infrastructure. So So with bathhouses and things that they put on the beach for recreation, they're doing it in a way that they can then pull them back when a storm's coming or when it's not the right season, instead of putting solid infrastructure in, which we have typically tended to do, and then it gets washed out by a storm, and then we have to go back and rebuild. They're doing it in a way that they can put them in, take them out, and be more flexible, so it doesn't cost as much. And the other one that I really like is, the public wants this parking lot in a particular location. It's very hard to say, look, this gets washed out, we can't do it, they want it anyway, so okay, fine, we're gonna use shells, we're gonna use materials that, you can park on it, but when it gets ripped up and goes back into the surf zone, you're not just putting concrete into the surf zone, so it's more of a sustainable option. So I thought that was kind of cool. And then the other is, a lot of outreach and education. They actually, after they did the scenario work, came to us and said, we really need to know how to communicate these to the public, tell them what it means, and how to get this into our plan. This is a sort of using photography as an example of an exhibit where they can sort of demonstrate to people this dynamic nature and the things that they're doing. So communication was a big deal for them. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of other sort of general things that we're working on. Communication is a really big deal for us overall. This is something that's been developed in the last couple of years. These are key messages that were done through our communication work group that we've got on our website that we're now using as jumping off points for parks to develop more specific interpretive displays and programs within their parks. So basically, acknowledging climate change is happening, that humans are contributing to that and accelerating it, that it has consequences, that the NPS is responding with practices, adaptation, and mitigation options, and that there are things we can do, that there are choices we can make now that make a difference. So those are interpretive messages that were developed within our interpretation and education branch. I was going to bring stacks of these. These are recent issues of Park Science that were just devoted to climate change in national parks. There was an special issue on adaptation and communication, as well as a follow-on one that was just on the research. These are really nice. These are really good if you have any interest in, as these are easy to find on the website. Just you can get to our public site, or you can just Google Park Science, and they're there. And I apologize for not bringing the stacks of hard copies in. And then
climate friendly.
We're being climate friendly. Yeah.
Electronically.
These are just sort of little snapshots of projects and stuff, but I really like this one too, that Angie Richmond, who's our communications specialist, and she's here in Fort Collins, is working. We had a number of parks that put proposals in. We fund some projects through our program, and they wanted to do exhibits on climate change in their parks. And so as the Washington office, we were able to go, let's have you guys work together. So we've now got a team specific to sort of coastal impacts that are not only getting their exhibit in their park, but they're using, some information technology, these QR codes that people can link the exhibit that's in Everglades with the one that's in Kenai Fjords, with the one that's in Point Reyes or Golden Gate. So you can go, sea level rise is occurring in a lot of areas. Here's how it's similar, here's how it's different, and start to get more at sort of overall literacy and, broader educational value. So I really like this. I think we're going to be doing a lot more linking one part to the other. I really like this particular project. And then I did want to make a pitch for our youth initiative. We have both an internship and a fellowship program, and the call for those is out right now. So if anybody's interested, you can also find that on our website. The internship is really, those are projects that are identified in parks. They say what they want, we approve a list, and then our university partner, which is University of Washington, actually right now, will canvass and find students to match to those projects, and these are usually in parks generally, sometimes in program offices. And the fellowship are student-defined research projects that we review independently, and it's a fellowship. You get your own funding to do research.
Could you explain the types of students you look for? Like, are they undergraduates, high school graduates, or what?
So generally, the internships have been undergraduates or master's students, interns. The fellows are masters or PhD candidates.
Both those people look way too young. I'm thinking they're high school, but I'm just getting old, I think.
And, one quick slide to just show you some of the folks that are in our office, in Fort Collins. We have some folks in Washington, D.C., and then we also support what we call affiliated staff, which are positions that are out in some of the regions, as well as in, some of the other directorates, like cultural resources or, water, or, John Gross, John, we support John's position in INS. So it's this idea of trying to have a very lean core team of experts, but then supporting the development of, climate change within the other, trying to have some strings attached, but, within other areas. So this is accessible with more information, contact information on our general website, www.nps.gov/climate change. And this is also a link to the My Green Partners, which is the main site for our sustainability, or sustainable operations program. And other than that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Great. Anyone have a question?
I was wondering, it looks like you've really developed your thinking and planning for developing scenarios and management plans and parks. And I was wondering how you engage other land managers around in parks, particularly those that are sort of like an island of other things. If they're maybe not wise.
Yeah, do you have any particular example or just in general? Yeah. Every workshop that we've done has had neighbors partner, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service or the Forest Service. We certainly, I think probably everyone has had USGS scientists that participate in one way or the other. We work with folks from NOAA. It's a great question. It's really important, and we can't force it, obviously, so we invite them. But the parks, we do like to have, sort of parks at, in a sense, at the centerpiece, because we're a Park Service organization. And oftentimes the parks have that highest level of protection associated with them as well. So we work with the parks to identify who their key partners are. And I would say, if we do a workshop of 30 people, at least 10 of them are going to be, at least a third of them are going to be non-Park Service, generally up to about half will be non-Park Service people. Not always other government entities, but, and then another example, Jeff was just participated in one that we had here in Fort Collins, which was more on the development of technique, but that was very purposefully sort of I won't say multi-jurisdictional, but multi-agency, in order to sort of expand our thinking about, is this relevant for others, and if so, how, and how can we work with you, whether it's directly on a landscape or just sharing approaches, because we need to be working together in our thinking on these and leveraging parallel processing. That's a great question. It's very important.
A decent share of academics, I think.
Yeah, always.
Some professor.
Yeah, when we do for scenario planning, they sort of say you need three kinds of people. You need your experts, your knowledge holders, and oftentimes for climate change, those are key scientists, but also other knowledge holders. You need your stakeholders that can, make a decision, and then you need curious and creative. So it's a balance, and hopefully you've got your scientists fulfill at least two of those. But anybody else?
I had a question on slide 13, I think it was, the four-step process or framework of starting with your management target or your decision.
There we go.
Framing the issue. I'm wondering, it has the blue arrow kind of going back once you got plan, implementation, and action.
Yeah.
And how much, when you frame the issue, and even in the structured decision-making class that the Department of Interior does, asks you to consider what options are available to someone. So it's almost like even before you frame the issue, you're already looking at that.
Like sort of restoration or, those
what's
types
the
of
what's the option
adaptation
space,
options?
It's sort of like, and in some ways that could limit your thinking.
Yeah.
Because you kind of want to maybe be outside the box.
Yeah.
But on the other end of that spectrum is you come up with a solution and somebody says, I can't do that, that's, we could thin every forest and put, an acre between it and we'd stop fires from happening in the Rocky Mountains, but you're like, okay, but we don't have
Not gonna do that.
$20 trillion and we're not gonna do it anyway.
Right.
So, I think it's a balance.
Like a feasibility.
Kinda,
Yeah.
How much does that come into that first step?
We try not to do it for the very reason that you said. Now, that said, we often will have kind of that list, and we will work it in, but not necessarily under the framing, because you are trying to explore
Right.
potential space, and even if you're exploring something that ultimately you won't be able to do, I mean, it's like, I think the example on fire is a really good one, and we're pushing the envelope on this. We've done it a little bit looking at Yellowstone. I've been working with Tony Westerling on thinking about fire and some of these, conifer systems, and I think that's a legitimate question. And when you think about the big matrix and the big problems and solutions, that's the hardest one to walk out, because you say, let's take climate change in its full-blown manifestation, which in many cases is a complete transformation of a forest, for example. And you go, if that's where we're headed, what are the actions we can take now? And you're right, for fire, they're pretty extreme, but we feel it's worth the exercise to say this is what it would take, and to ask the question of whether it's feasible or not. You need to get that laid out on the table, because if that's what it would take, and it isn't feasible, then you need people to go, okay, well, what is? And if you don't do that collectively, if you don't get the fire guys in the room, then you're just going to be saying, well, we need to do this, or we need to do that, or we can't, but you don't ever get to, well, what is feasible? No action is an action, so if you want to get people to some action, you have to put some things out of the way, and you kind of have to walk through it logically to get them there. So, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Even if it isn't feasible, you kind of have to go there.
It's almost like human nature constrains us enough.
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna, everybody's gonna think about feasible, almost be constrained by the world they live in and what's reasonable.
That's right. And there are things that people don't want to consider. I showed a picture early on of Koloko Honokahau, which is a cultural resource park in Hawaii. And we're going back there actually in November to work with them a little more closely. And what this is these are fish ponds, right, that have been there. The Native Hawaiians have built the fish ponds so that when the storms come in, the fish come over and then they're trapped. It's very ingenious, and then they've got access to them. So now they're being preserved as a part of this natural and cultural park. And sea level rise is obviously threatening the existence of this structure, which is constantly maintained in relationship with the Hawaiians. And they've got a lot of other issues. They've got, they're a small park along the coast. They've got all this development right behind them. They don't have any place to go with the park. And getting a park like this to talk about the big picture, what do you do if you get completely inundated? And they're like, they don't even want to talk about it. But you can work with their partners and you say, well, what's the basis of this park? It demonstrates the relationship of the indigenous culture with the natural environment, how they work within the natural environment. So, can we still exemplify that? Can we still talk about that somewhere? It's really hard to get people to move away and say, okay, if this things I don't want to think about, if they happen, does that mean the whole thing goes away? There's no meaning, there's no value. There are actually a lot of options. There really are. It's not what you want, but you can interpret it, look for another location, and there are things that you can still preserve basic. That's just another example in terms of culture. If you don't explore it, you can't go there, you won't come with it. Talk about implementation of. I was wondering if you have examples given multiple plans. How often? Do you have an example where the actually that is scenario planning put it into a park plan? And do you think that is critical or will impact the process? So I think it is critical. several examples. They're not always as explicit as you might be thinking. So one example is back to Oct12 Welling and their general management plan. So they went through scenario planning, and they have incorporated the scenarios and what they've learned into the plan, but it's not in a way that says, under scenario 1, arch ponies. They don't do that. They don't line it out exactly as they defined it. So it's maybe a hybrid of, I think, what you're asking, so that the process gets you there. It informs your thinking, and then you use that information, hopefully explicitly with the science, in your planning process, but it's not a one-to-one, this scenario becomes an alternative, or they don't do it one-to-one relationship. And I wouldn't encourage them to do that, because part of getting your thinking around different scenarios is the storytelling, and there are things that you do to try to walk it out mentally, and that wouldn't always translate exactly. So it's more. So let me give you another example. So Oct12 is incorporated in another one, as Tina George talked about, and that's the other spectrum where no, they haven't moved it directly into a specific plan, but what they do, the park superintendent up there just now, he cited scenarios sitting on the wall, and he floats his decisions through it. So he uses the scenarios like a wind tunnel. Something happens, thinks about why did this happen? Like our road just got washed out again, exit glacier. Now it's happening every 10 years. Now it's every year. Climate change, the natural variability. Should I go back and rebuild the road? So those types of things. He looks at these scenarios and uses his judgment based on, still uncertain, but based on the work that we did. So yeah, we're explicitly moving it in some cases, in other cases it's used to kind of inform process. Another specific example is the supporting companion. We've done that whole process of vulnerability very explicitly in the plans that they're doing in coordination with the board. So not done yet, but those scenarios will very explicitly do it. So we're getting examples. But sometimes it's not as direct as people might want it to be. But I'm not sure that. I think both of those are important. I think in some cases it could be directly explicit, but other times it just changes the way you think in a way that might not be quantifiable, but it's still really valuable.
Are there any formal mechanisms for planning innovation in individual parks, for example, the parking lot example you said, or even in educational way that works really well? Is there any formal mechanisms for
park to park?
Yeah.
Yeah. We just started this year a pilot as part of our training, superintendent training on climate change. And the way we're doing that is to have our climate leaders, our superintendents, and Trish Kickleiter at Oct12 is one of them, the ones that are starting to implement these kinds of actions. We're asking them to present to us here. So it's a training for new superintendents, and we're calling on individual, more seasoned superintendents to share their examples. So that's formal training, but it's done as a peer-to-peer. Here's what I did. We think that probably works better than having us tell them what they should do, because they want to be challenged by. That's our first start. Hoping to work on that.
All right, well, let's thank Lee again for